Welcome everyone. It is 3 p.m. and it's time for the Server Room Show. This is episode 74, if I'm not mistaken. Let me quickly just confirm. Yes, it is episode 74. This is part 2 of the story or history of Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC for short. The story we started to recollect and discuss in the previous episode 73. So in episode 74 of this one, we continue the history or the recollection of the story of Digital Equipment Corporation. I've talked about the early origins of Digital Equipment Corporation and the early successes with the digital modules and the entry into programmable data processors, as they call them, the entry of the PDP or the launch of the PDP family with the PDP-1, and I spoke about the PDP-8 family, the PDP-10 family, and that's where we stopped in our story. This episode again will be like the previous ones, where I'm not really recording a screencast and the webcam, including me on the lower right corner. I will continue on trying this audiogram kind of product on YouTube, where you can listen to my voice with the animation of the audio or a waveform. Because as I explained previously in episode 73, I don't think that as of it is right now, as I'm not really showing anything on my screen, the only thing you could see is my notes I'm using for recording these audios, these podcast episodes, and seeing me on a webcam, I don't think it adds a lot of value. So we continue on with this no screencast and no video version. So let's see where that takes us. The next we have to talk about in this part 2 of DEC, the history and recollection of Digital Equipment Corporation, is DEC tape. One of the most unusual peripherals produced for the PDP-10 was the DEC tape. The DEC tape was a length of special 3/4 inch wide magnetic tape wound on 5-inch reels. The recording format was a highly reliable, redundant 10-track design using fixed length numbered data blocks organized into a standard file structure, including a directory. Files could be written, read, changed and deleted on a DEC tape as though it were a disk drive. For greater efficiency, the DEC tape drive could read and write to a DEC tape in both directions. In fact, some PDP-10 systems had no disks at all, using DEC tapes alone for their primary data storage. The DEC tape was also widely used on other PDP models, since it was much easier to use than hand-loading multiple paper tapes. Primitive early time-sharing systems could use DEC tapes as system devices and swapping devices. Although superior to paper tape, DEC tapes were relatively slow and were supplanted once reliable disk drives became affordable. Magnetic disk storage. DEC was both the manufacturer and the buyer of magnetic disk storage, offering more than 100 different models of hard disk drive and floppy disk drive during its existence. In the 1970s, it was the single largest OEM purchaser of HDDs, producing from Diablo, Control Data Corporation, Information Storage Systems, and Memorex, among others. DEC's first internally developed HDD was the RS-08, 256 K-word fixed head contact start-stop drive using plated media. It shipped in 1969. Beginning in the 1970s, DEC moved first its HDD manufacturing and then its mass storage development labs to Colorado Springs. DEC pioneered a number of HDD technologies, including sample data servos, RL01 in 1977, and serial HDD interfaces, standard disk interconnect in 1983. The last internally developed disk drive family, RA9X series, used plated media, departing from the HDD industry trend to carbon overcoated sputtered media. DEC designated $400 million investment to bring this product line into production. The RA92, a 1.5 gigabyte hard disk, was introduced in 1992 using a 14-inch platter. DEC purchased its FDDs from OEMs such as Shugart Associates, Toshiba, and Sony. Now we arrived to one of the most famous ones, to talk about the PDP-11. The PDP-11 16-bit computer was designed in a crash program by Harold McFarland, Gordon Bell, Roger Cady, and others. The project was able to leap forward in design with the arrival of Harold McFarland, who had been researching 16-bit designs at Carnegie Mellon University. One of his simpler designs became the PDP-11, although when they first viewed the proposal, management was not impressed and almost cancelled it. In particular, the new design did not include many of the addressing modes that were intended to make programs smaller in memory, a technique that was widely used on other DEC machines and CISC designs in general. This would mean the machine would spend more time accessing memory, which would slow it down. However, the machine also extended the idea of multiple general-purpose registers, GPRs, which gave the programmer flexibility to use these high-speed memory caches as they needed, potentially addressing the performance issues. A major advance in the PDP-11 design was DEC's Unibus, which supported all peripherals through memory mapping. This allowed a new device to be added easily, generally only requiring plugging a hardware interface board into the backplane and possibly adding a jumper to the wire backplane, and then installing software that read and wrote to the map memory to control it. The relative ease of interfacing spawned a huge market of third-party add-ons for the PDP-11, which made the machine even more successful. The combination of architectural innovations proved superior to competitors, and the 11 architecture was soon the industry leader, propelling DEC back to a strong market position. The design was later expanded to a low-paged physical memory and memory protection features useful for multitasking and time sharing. Some models supported separate instruction and data spaces for an effective virtual address size of 128 kilobytes within a physical address size of up to 4 megabytes. Smaller PDP-11s implemented as single-chip CPUs continued to be produced until 1996, by which time over 600,000 had been sold. The PDP-11 supported several operating systems, including Bell Labs' new Unix operating system, as well as DEC's DOS-11, RSX-11, IES, RT-11, DSM-11, and RSDS-E. Many early PDP-11 applications were developed using standalone paper tape utilities. DOS-11 was the PDP-11's first disk operating system, but was soon supplanted by more capable systems. RSX provided a general-purpose multitasking environment and supported a wide variety of programming languages. IES was a time-sharing version of RSX-11D. Both RSDS and Unix were time-sharing systems available to educational institutions at little or no cost, and these PDP-11 systems were destined to be the sandbox for a rising generation of engineers and computer scientists. Large numbers of PDP-11-70s were deployed in telecommunications and industrial control applications. AT&T Corporation became DEC's largest customer. RT11 provided a practical real-time operating system in minimal memory, allowing the PDP-11 to continue DEC's critical role as a computer supplier for embedded systems. Historically, RT11 also served as the inspiration for many microcomputer operating systems, as these were generally being written by programmers who cut their teeth on one of the many PDP-11 models. For example, CP-M used the command syntax similar to RT11's and even retained the awkward PIP program used to copy data from one computer device to another. As another historical footnote, DEC's use of pair for switches command line, or the dash for switches command line options, would lead to the adoption of the backward slash for path names in Microsoft DOS and Microsoft Windows, as opposed to the forward slash in Unix. So just again to read it properly, as another historical footnote, DEC's use of the forward slash for switches for command line options would lead to the adoption of the backward slash for path names in Microsoft DOS and Microsoft Windows, as opposed to forward slash in Unix. The evolution of the PDP-11 followed earlier systems, eventually including a single-user desk-side personal computer form, the Micro PDP-11. In total, around 100,000 PDP-11s of all models were sold, and a wide variety of third-party peripherals vendors had also entered the computer product ecosystem. Now, next, one of the another famous from Digital Equipment Corporation is the VAX. In 1976, DEC decided to extend the PDP-11 architecture to 32 bits, while adding a complete virtual memory system to the simple paging and memory protection of the PDP-11. The result was the VAX architecture, where VAX stands for Virtual Address Extension, from 16 to 32 bits. The first computer to use a VAX CPU was the VAX-11/780, which DEC referred to as a super mini computer. Although it was not the first 32-bit mini computer, the VAX-11/780 80's combination of features, price and marketing almost immediately propelled it to a leadership position in the market after it was released in 1978. VAX systems were so successful that in 1983 DEC cancelled its Jupiter project, which had been intended to build a successor to the PDP-10 mainframe, and instead focused on promoting the VAX as the single computer architecture for the company. Supporting the VAX success was the VT52, one of the most successful smart terminals. Building on earlier less successful models, the VT05 and the VT50, the VT52 was the first terminal that did everything one might want in a single chassis. The VT52 was followed by the even more successful VT100 and its follows on, making DEC one of the largest terminal vendors in the industry. With the VT series, DEC could now offer a complete top-to-bottom system, from computer to all peripherals, which formerly required collecting the required devices from different suppliers. The VAX processor architecture and family of systems evolved and expanded through several generations during the 1980s, culminating in the NVAX microprocessor implementation and the VAX 7000-10000 series in the early 1990s. I think at some point I will have to make a separate episode focusing on the VAX, because it truly deserves a separate episode. Early microcomputers, when a DEC research group demonstrated two prototype microcomputers in 1974 before the debut of the MITS Altair, Olsen chose to not proceed with the project. The company similarly rejected another personal computer proposal in 1977. At the time, these systems were of limited utility, and Olson famously derided them in 1977, stating there is no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. Unsurprisingly, DEC did not put much effort into the microcomputer era in the early days of the market. In 1977, the HeatKit H11 was announced, a PDP-11 in a kit form. At the beginning of the 1980s, DEC built the VT180, codenamed Robin, which was a VT100 terminal with an added Z80-based microcomputer running CP-M, but this product was initially available only to DEC employees. It was only after IBM had successfully launched the IBM PC in 1981 that DEC responded with their own systems. In 1982, DEC introduced not one but three incompatible machines, which were each tied to different proprietary architectures. The first, the DEC Professional, was based on the PDP-11-23 and later the 11-73, running the RSX-11M+, derived but menu-driven P-OS professional operating system. This DEC machine easily outperformed the PC but was more expensive than and completely incompatible with IBM PC hardware and software, offering far fewer options for customizing a system. Unlike CP-M and DOS microcomputers, every copy of every program for the professional had to be provided with a unique key for the particular machine and CPU for which it was bought. At that time, this was a mainstream policy because most computer software was either bought from the company that built the computer or custom constructed for one client. However, the emerging third-party software industry disregarded the PDP-11 and the professional line and concentrated on other microcomputers where distribution was easier. At DEC itself, creating better programs for the professional was not a priority, perhaps from fear of cannibalizing the PDP-11 line. As a result, the professional was a superior machine running inferior software. In addition, a new user would have to learn an awkward, slow and inflexible menu-based user interface, which appeared to be radically different from PC-DOS or CP-M, which were more commonly used on the 8080 and the 8088 based microcomputers of the time. The second offering, the VAXmate 2, was the latest version of the PDP-8 based word processor, but not really suited to general computing, nor competitive with Wang Laboratories' popular word processing equipment. DEC Rainbow 100 was also an example. The most popular early DEC microcomputer was the dual processor Z80 and 8088 DEC Rainbow 100, which ran the 8-bit CP-M operating system on the Z80 and the 16-bit CP-M 86 operating system on the Intel 8080 processor. It could also run a Unix System 3 implementation called Venix. Applications from standard CP-M could be recompiled for the Rainbow, but by this time users were expecting custom-built pre-compiled binary applications such as Lotus 123, which was eventually ported along with Microsoft DOS 2.0 and introduced in late 1983. Although the Rainbow generated some press, it was unsuccessful due to its high price and lack of marketing and sales support. By late 1983, IBM was outselling DEC's personal computers by more than 10 to 1. The DEC RX50, the way the 400 kilobyte DEC standard RX50 floppy disk drive supported DEC's initial offerings seemed to encapsulate their approach to the personal computer market. Although the mechanical drive hardware was nearly identical to other 5.25-inch floppy disk drives available on competing systems, DEC sought to differentiate their product by using a proprietary disk format for the data written on the disk. The DEC format had a higher capacity for data, but the RX50 drives were incompatible with other PC floppy drives. This required DEC owners to buy higher price, specially formatted floppy media, which was harder to obtain through standard distribution channels. DEC attempted to enforce exclusive control over its floppy media sales by copyrighting its proprietary disk format and requiring a negotiated license agreement and royalty payments from anybody selling compatible media. The proprietary data format meant that RX50 floppies were not interchangeable with other PC floppies, further isolating DEC products from the developing de facto standard PC market. Hardware hackers and DEC enthusiasts eventually reverse engineered the RX50 format, but the damage had already been done in terms of market confusion and isolation. The Waxmate, a further system, was introduced in 1986 as the Waxmate, which included Microsoft Windows 1.0 and used Wax VMS-based file and print servers, along with integration into DEC's own DECnet family, providing LAN WAN connection from PC to mainframe or Super Mini. The Waxmate replaced the Rainbow and in its standard form was the first widely marketed diskless workstation. The operating system and files could be served from Wax VMS server running the company's Wax VMS service for Microsoft DOS software, which went through several name changes, finally becoming Patworks. Alternatively, an optional expansion box containing either 20 megabyte or 40 megabyte hard disk could be purchased, which allowed it to operate as a more conventional standalone PC. The basic system contained an 8 MHz Intel 8286 CPU with 1 megabyte of RAM, 1.2 megabyte RX33 5.25-inch floppy disk drive, a 14-inch diagonal amber or green monochrome CRT, and a thin wire Ethernet interface, all contained in the system unit. It was also provided with a parallel printer port and a serial communications port. A separate mouse and LK250 keyboard was used with the device. As well as the expansion box, an 8287 numeric coprocessor could be ordered as an option, and the memory could be expanded by 2 megabytes with another option to 3 megabytes. In North America, an internal modem was also available. It was superseded by the DECstation 200 and 300 in January 1989. I want to talk about a bit more about, I did mention previously the DEC Professional. The DEC Professional 325, 350 and 380 were PDP-11 compatible microcomputers, were partially compatible to the DEC PDP-11 systems, which were introduced in 1982 by Digital FM Corporation as high-end competitors to the IBM PC. Like the cosmetically similar Rainbow 100 and DECmate 2, also introduced around that time, the Pro series used the LK201 keyboard and 400 kilobyte single-sided quad-density floppy disk drives, known as the RX50, as I just talked about it, and offered the choice of color or monochrome monitors. For DEC, none of the three would be favorably received, and the industry instead standardized on Intel 8080 based IBM PC compatibles, which were all binary program compatible with each other as I said previously. In some ways, the PDP-11 microprocessor were technically superior to the Intel-based chips, while the 8080 was restricted to 1 megabyte of memory because of its 20-bit address bus. DEC microprocessors were capable of accessing 4 megabyte with their 22-bit addressing, although direct addressing of memory was limited in both approaches to 64 kilobyte segments, limiting the size of individual code and data objects. But other factors would be I lost my line. But other factors would weigh more heavily in the competition, including DEC's corporate culture and business model, which were ill-suited to the rapidly developing consumer market for computers. Byte in 1984 reported that Vanix on the PC outperformed the same operating system on the DEC Professional and PDP-11-23. Further along, the PDP-11 was a very successful mini computer. It lacked a wide base of affordable. Although the PDP-11 was a very successful mini computer, it lacked a wide base of affordable small business software. By comparison, many existing CP-M applications were easily ported to the similar 8086, 8080 chips and Microsoft DOS operating system. Porting existing PDP-11 software to the Pro was complicated by design decisions that rendered it partially incompatible with its parent product line. Industry critics observed that this incompatibility appeared at least in part deliberate, as DEC belatedly sought to protect its more profitable mainstream PDP-11s from price competition with lower priced PCs. The Pro was never widely accepted as an office personal computer, nor as a scientific workstation, where the market was also headed to Intel 8086 or alternately to Motorola 68000 based computers. The failure of DEC to gain a significant foothold in the high-volume PC market would be the beginning of the end of the computer hardware industry in New England, as nearly all computer companies located there were focused on mini computers for large organizations, from DEC to Data General, Wang, Prime, Computer Vision, Honeywell, and Symbolics INC. The Pro 325 and 350 used the F11 chipset to create a single board PDP-11 with up to 6 expansion slots of a proprietary CTI computing terminal interconnect bus using 90-pin ZIF connectors. The Pro family used dual RX50 floppy drives for storage, and the Pro 325 had only floppies, and the 350 and 380 also included an internal hard drive. Mainline PDP-11s generally used separate serial terminals as console and display devices. The Pro family used inbuilt bitmap graphics to drive a combined console and display. The default Pro series operating system was DEC's Professional Operating System, PDS-OS, a modified version of RSX11M with a menu-driven core user interface. Industry critics complained that this user interface was awkward, slow, and inflexible, offering few advantages over the command line-based Microsoft DOS user interface that was coming into widespread use. Other available operating systems included the DEC RT11, VentureCom, Vanix, and 2.9 BSD Unix. I think this was enough for part 2, and as I see, there is still enough left for a part 3 of the history of Digital Equipment Corporation, which will mostly focus, as I see in the notes, on the little bit of the failing on the market and the alphas and eventually the final years and the sell-offs. So that is going to be the last part 3 of the story of Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC for short, and you can enjoy it next Saturday in episode 75. Thank you very much, and see you next Saturday.